Okay, is housing first a solution to homelessness?
I think what's really important to understand about Housing First is it's a very effective narrative. And here's what I mean by that. I just talked about the 1990s, dark years for Canadian housing policy, also dark years for Canadian social policy in general. It was a terrible time if you were vulnerable in Canada. Governments were really scaling back what they were spending on social protection. Advocates for the homeless tend to say that it's important to build social housing and to provide increased income, enhanced income assistance, and to fund more for people in need. That typically requires substantially higher levels of spending by senior orders of government, and sometimes it may even require higher taxes. In the 1990s, senior orders of government did not like hearing that. All of a sudden, there was a major focus on deficits and debts and lowering taxes. And so it was a tough time to be a homelessness advocate in Canada because governments were really reluctant to spend. And along comes some narrative called Housing First, where clever advocates figured out that instead of asking senior decision makers to spend more, they could just ask them to redistribute existing funding. And that's what has made Housing First so successful and so commonly heard as a universal term now in the homelessness sector. Because all of a sudden we had clever advocates saying, you don't need to spend substantially more, you just need to redistribute what you've got. And so along came this bashing of the nonprofit sector. It started, key advocates started to say that the nonprofit sector and grassroots frontline workers were not being efficient with the resources they had. They were creating this industry, and what they really needed was to start housing people directly from homelessness. That had already been happening throughout from the 1980s, when homelessness became a pressing public policy issue in Ontario. Housing policy started to change, and housing started to be made available in principle for people who were experiencing homelessness. We had something called supportive housing, which was huge in Toronto, for example, and Ottawa as early as the 1980s. That was very similar to what is now described as Housing First. But not everyone knew that history. And a lot of people drank the Kool-Aid that was being sort of marketed by key advocates who said, we've got this brand new invention called giving somebody who's homeless a house. That wasn't that new, but a lot of key decision makers believed the narrative and thought that a redistribution of existing resources would have a profound impact on homelessness. Well, look at homelessness numbers today and look at them 10 years ago and 20 years ago. There hasn't been a major downward shift in most cities of the homeless population. If Housing First was revolutionary, why is it that Housing First hasn't created a larger dent in the homeless numbers? It's because it wasn't that revolutionary. It was a new narrative, and it was effective as a narrative and still effective as a narrative.